Hi, this is Bob from INSYDIUM, and in this video tutorial we'll be creating a destruction scene using xpShatter and xpBullet rigid body dynamics, and we'll be recreating a simplified version of this wall shatter. So here we are in a blank scene. Let's set up this destruction shot. So first of all, we want a dynamic floor. So we'll just bring in a cube primitive and we'll set the Y to be 10 centimeters and we'll make it pretty big. Let's make it, let's say 4,000 on the X and 3,000 on the Z, and we'll just dolly out a bit. So we have this large floor area. Okay, and that's going to be our floor. So let's rename it. Let's get organized. Basic, cube, and let's call it floor. And we'll just give ourselves a little bit more room here in our attributes manager. All right, so this is a floor. This needs to be dynamic. We want bullet objects to bounce off it and interact with it. So we need to make it dynamic itself. So to do that, we'll go to tags, INSYDIUM tags, bullet tags, xpBullet collider, and we'll just leave all of those settings on the default. So now we need our wall. This is the thing that we're going to smash through. So let's make let's get another cube primitive. And this time we can maybe more eyeball it this time. So let's make it a nice wide wall and give it a bit of depth. And then let's just have a look at the height of that wall. So it's 200 centimeters. Let's try it 600 centimeters. And then we want this to be touching the floor. At the moment, it's intersecting our floor because its anchor point is in the middle, its axis center. So what we need to do is move it up by 300 centimeters and it'll be exactly touching that floor. So let's go to coordinates and move it up by 300. And now it is almost on the floor, but it's slightly intersecting. And the reason for that is that our floor has a height of 10 centimeters. So we need to just drop this position down by -5. And there we go. So now the surface of this floor object is at world 0 on the y-axis. And our wall is sitting on top of it. Excellent. So let's call that cube, rename it wall. All right. So now we need to make, well, we can just make that wall dynamic, but actually we're going to be breaking this wall into pieces. So let's just bring in the tools that will enable us to do that. So we will bring in an xParticle system to stay organized. So let's go to INSYDIUM, xParticles, system. Let's just delete that default emitter just for now. And in this system, we need to go to the generators menu. Let's go to the object tab and we're going to choose a generator and we're going to pick an xpShatter. There it is. Let's get our wall and make it a child of the shatter. And you can see that we have these shatter points. We can see the new edges that the shatter has used a Voronoi shattering algorithm to come up with these pieces, and we can see those cut edges with these blue lines. So let's just, what I'd like to do is hit NB so we can see the shading and the lines. And now we've done that, we don't need to see these blue lines that Shatter was giving us. These are just the default Cinema 4D lines. So let's go to the Shatter object, we'll go to the Display tab, and we will deselect draw cut edges. And now we just have those cut edges. Excellent. So let's just have a look at how this shattered effect was done. If we go to our xpShatter, we'll go to the object tab, you can see that we have a shatter layer. And by default, we have a Voronoi layer, and it is using this point generator. This is the child. This is what it's using to create this shattering pattern. And what the point generator is doing, it's doing that. It's generating points. So let's view those so we can see what they look like. We'll go to display and we will select draw shatter points. So there we are. Go back to our object tab, to our point generator, and you can see these white points. And these are being generated within the meshes bounding box. And we have a number of points 40. So if we put this down to 20, There'll be fewer points, therefore larger pieces. And if we cycle through the seeds, we'll get different distribution of those 20 points. And you can see we're getting different looks there. And it's all kind of updating in real time as we go. Excellent. So let's leave that now as our base shatter. Let's go to our display tag and just switch off those shatter points. So let's make this shatter dynamic. We'll go to our shatter object. We'll go to tags, INSYDIUM tags, bullet, rigid body. Click on that. Now when we hit play, gravity is taking hold and all of those individual shards are behaving independently and falling to the ground. Let's just give ourselves some more frames in our timeline. And we can see this develop, and there they go. They're all falling down. Some of them are kind of like keeping each other up, but we can see that they're all dynamic. And if we, let's just demonstrate, if we get the shatter, let's just move it up a bit. And in the object tab, look, we can explode these pieces out a bit. So if we start it at this position and hit play, then they're all going to fall to the ground. And these are all behaving independently with fantastic collisions. All right, excellent. So let's just get rid of that explode and we'll put the coordinates back to where they were. Excellent. So this is triggering straight away these dynamics. As soon as we hit play, they're triggering and gravity is pulling those down. And because we have these kind of diagonal cuts, this piece and these pieces are able to slide off, which they do straight away. We could make them a bit more grippy. We could go to our bullet tag, and in the simulation dynamics tab, look, we could give it more friction. And now it's harder for it to slide off. This is quite a steep angle, so that one obviously fell. But look, this one's really trying to grip on for dear life. So that's increasing the friction between those shards. Let's just put that back down to the default. So at the moment, this is the dynamics are being triggered immediately. And if we have a look in our simulation dynamics tab, you can see that we have an activate option and it's set to immediate. But look, we could set this to after time. Let's put 60 frames. And now you're going to see that there is no dynamics, but then at 60 frames, now they become active. So that's useful for timing your dynamics. We can also trigger these dynamics on collision. And now this will wait for another bullet object to collide with this. And when it does, it'll then become dynamic. Now, if we put this speed threshold down to 0 and hit play, they still activate. So why have they activated even though we've put only activate on collision? Well, they have collided with themselves. These are all deemed separate objects. And because they're touching, that means that they've collided, which means that they immediately trigger those dynamics and these bits fall down. However, if we increase the speed threshold, this is saying they have to be moving 20 centimeters per second or that movement will be ignored and the collisions won't be activated. So if we hit play, because these are static, they're not moving that quickly. So now those rigid body collisions haven't been triggered. They're not active. So that's useful if we want our wall to stand and we want it to shatter at a certain point. So let's get that set up. We're going to use a shatter object to kind of throw in the direction of our wall to smash it. So let's just use another primitive. Let's use a platonic. And let's move that platonic up here. There it is. Something like that. And we need to make this platonic dynamic as well. So let's just move that into our utilities folder so we can stay organized, and we'll put the floor in there as well. So our platonic needs its own tag. So let's go to tags, INSYDIUM tags, bullet tags, rigid body. And now if we hit play, you'll see that it is set by default to activate immediately. So if we hit play, the platonic drops to the floor, bounces and settles. But we want it to go towards our wall. So we can give it some initial velocity. Let's have a look in our tag. So simulation, dynamics, we can move down to linear velocity. And these three boxes are the three axes. So we have X, Y, and Z. So we want it to move in the plus X direction. Here's the X axis. We want it to go in the plus X direction. So let's give it a linear velocity of, say, 1,000 of the plus X, which means when we hit play, it hits the wall. Fantastic. And it's managed to, has it triggered our dynamics? We think it may have done, but our platonic isn't very big. In fact, it's smaller than most of these shards, and that means it's not going to be as heavy. So it's not got the, it doesn't have the mass to knock this around. So what we can do is we can change that. Let's go to our platonic. Let's go to the mass tab. And by default, it's just set to world density. So basically, the bigger the object is, the greater its mass will be. But we could change that. Look, we can give it a custom density. And then let's put this on, say, 10. So now this is going to have a far greater mass. It's going to be much heavier. So when we hit play, bang, and it's able to move that wall. And the wall, as soon as it is hit by the platonic, the dynamics are activated and those pieces fall down. Now we could, simulate this and imagine that this is an incredibly heavy, high velocity cannonball. Look, let's give it a density of 100. Bang, and it really smashes through that wall. And we can obviously go to that tag, go to dynamics. We can make it quicker, give it more of that initial linear velocity. So this is really going to fly through. That's it. And because it's got such a high density value and therefore it's got such a high mass, it is hardly, its momentum is hardly touched by our wall. So obviously it's a little bit too much. So let's go back to our mass and we'll set it to, say, 10. There we go, and it's smashing through and looking really cool. And what's fantastic about both Shatter and using it in conjunction with the xpBullet system is that we can just, this is all procedural, so we can make adjustments as we go. So in our Shatter, let's go to our object and to that point generator. Remember, we've only got 20 points here, but look, we could make 50 points. We've got loads more Shatter points now. Let's just cycle through a couple of seeds until we get something we like the look of. That one's looking good. Hit play. And now we've got loads more points, which are shattering. So that's really cool. And that's just scratching the surface. So what else can we explore? Well, Shatter has got the ability to do what's called recursive shattering. And that means that we have shattered the wall already. But let's say when this piece hits the floor, we want it to shatter again. How would we do that? Well, let's go to our shatter layer. So just so we've got, for speed of simulation here and for ease of viewing the effects of this, let's put fewer points on our point generator. So we're going to go to, say, 20. All right. So now what we want to do is set up a layer that shatters the bigger pieces into smaller pieces. So let's do that. We're just going to deactivate this Voronoi and let's double click it and rename it and call it base shatter. Okay. And we're going to add another layer and we're going to do another Voronoi. So it's underneath and we're going to call this one recursive. So this is exactly the same. We have a Voronoi layer and we have a point generator making all of the points. And this, so this point generator, this is going to dictate how many pieces will be made from the existing shards that we've created. So just to demonstrate, let's put this on fewer points. There we go. So now if we activate our base layer, we have our base layer shards and they have been sub-shattered into 5 pieces. And if I go and put this on, say, 10, you can see we've got even more pieces. But at the moment, if we go up to the Voronoi layer that we've called recursive, at the moment, it is set to trigger always. So it's always shattered that amount. But what we can do is we can change that. We can do it at speed. We can do it on collision. There's various different options. So let's just put it on collision. So now, once these have collided with another, we're going to just set a bullet collision. So once they have been hit by a bullet object, they will shatter once again. And again, we can put a speed threshold here. So just by them hitting each other isn't going to trigger this. So let's put this speed, let's just put it on 5. So let's have a look. As we hit play, our platonic hits the wall, and look, those pieces have shattered again, and this one has shattered again. So let's just make more points so it's more obvious. We're only making 10, let's make 20, okay? And let's hit play. Then you can see them smashing into pieces once they collide. Look at this one smashing into all of these pieces as it hits the floor. So that's working really nicely. We're getting this realistic recursive shattering as we get more pieces smashing. And of course, again, this is all procedural. So if we want the base layer to be more detailed, let's go back to our point generator of our base shatter, put that up to say 40, hit play. And now we're getting an even more detailed base layer, which gives us more detail again when we come to the recursive shattering layer. So that's giving us a lot of nice extra detail for free. And we can, of course, go to our recursive layer. Let's reduce that speed, put that collision on, say, 1, and then it's going to be much more likely to shatter when it's getting these collisions. You can see all those pieces shattering. And now we're getting loads more in our scene. Okay, I'll put that back up to, say, 3. Excellent. That's looking really nice. So recursive shattering is a really nice way of adding a bit of more kind of realism and impact to these types of destruction scenes. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to delete that recursive layer, because what we're going to do now is, instead of just having these very kind of randomly positioned cuts in our xpShatter, we're actually going to create a shatter layer which is much more precise, which is allowing us as artists to place exactly where and how our object is going to crack and be shattered. So we're going to use splines to do this. So let's go and we'll actually deactivate this base shatter layer. We'll come back to that a little later. So let's go to our orthographic views. If we hit F5, we get our options, and we're going to want to be in the right-hand viewport. Let's maximize this. Just dolly out a bit. So we're in wireframe view here. Let's go to the display and we'll pick shading with lines. And there we go. So we're kind of facing front on our wall. So let's make a spline to dictate where our wall is going to crack. So in our reference video, you'll see that we had a spline that was, let's just pick this spline tool. We had kind of a wavy spline, and we can draw this Bezier spline a little bit like that. Hit escape. Hit F1 to go back to perspective view, and you can see our spline is kind of right in the world origin there, intersecting our wall. So let's just take that spline, could move it out, there it is. And so it was cracking the wall in this direction on that reference. But actually, we're going to do something slightly different on this one. We're going to do a vertical crack. So let's just delete that spline, hit F5 again, and it was the right hand view we wanted, so let's maximize that. We'll get our spline tool, and let's just make a nice kind of vertical spline right down the middle. Hit escape, hit F1, back to perspective view. If we take that spline, move it out, now we have this black spline. And that's what we're going to use to crack our wall right down the middle. Okay, so let's go back to our shatter. And what we need to do is add another layer. So we're going to use another Voronoi layer. So let's just click on Voronoi here. And it looks very similar to the way in which it did before. We have a Voronoi layer, and it's using a point generator to create the points which set the shards. So instead of using a point generator to generate the points, let's just delete that point generator. We want to use this spline. So let's just drag in the spline as a child of the Voronoi layer. And we're getting quite an interesting looking shatter. It's certainly not what we want, but it looks pretty cool. And if we hit play, it's going to be dynamic, and we get these kind of boards have broken. So obviously it could be wooden planks. But as I say, that's not really what we want. We want it to kind of crack down this middle section. So how might we do that? Well, let's go to our shatter. Let's go to our display options and let's draw those shatter points again. We click that and you can see that it's using the points on the spline as the shatter points. So let's go back to the Object tab in the Shatter. And if we highlight the spline, we can see its settings. We can see at the bottom, look here, point type, use object points. But if we want a more regular distribution of points, we can click on this menu and pick Generate Points Along Spline. Let's do that. And now we have an even distributed points, and we've got 10 in total. And we can increase this, look, and make more and more points. Pretty cool. But again, it's not what we want. We're getting these long, thin planks. So this is the cool thing about these types of point generators. With our spline active, we can add modifiers and we can spawn extra points around these points. So let's go to our modifiers menu and pick a spawn points modifier. And you can see that we've got loads of points clumped up in and around those original ones. And in our layers window, we now have a spawn points modifier under our spline. So let's highlight that. And we are spawning 10 extra points within a radius of 10 centimeters. So let's increase that. Let's put that up to say 60. Ah, there we go. Now, so if we go to the display tab and now make these shatter points invisible, now we're starting to get a shatter pattern that we want. It's getting to that point, isn't it, where we're getting this interesting line down the middle of our wall. So if we then hit play, this is obviously still dynamic, and we're getting that nice crack down there. So this is looking cool. Let's go back to our shatter and make some adjustments. We'll go to the Object tab. We can add more points. Look, we can add, say, 20 points. We've got even more detail now, but let's just for now leave it at 10. And let's reactivate our base shatter layer. So we'll activate that. And now we have that original shattered Voronoi pattern, and we then have kind of subdivided it along those spline points. And we've got this really detailed shatter in this section. And remember this, again, it remains procedural. So if we go to our base shatter point generator, we can make fewer points. So we've got some bigger chunks before we then start shattering here. We can change the seed to get different distribution. And we can go to our spline. Look, in the spline, we could maybe put fewer points on the spline itself, but then put more points on the spawns. Let's say 20. And let's a radius of, say, 70. Let's try 30 points. And we can carry on doing this until we've got this kind of look that we desire. But we're kind of getting there. We're kind of getting much more detail here where it is required. So let's just hit play there. And now it's shattering much more down that middle section. Okay, let's go back to our shatter. So now that we have got that, this is looking pretty interesting, isn't it? We have got our extra bit of detail. Then we could add some more recursive shattering as an extra layer, should we wish, which comes after this. And so we're getting even more detail for those those shatter realism in the rubble. So that's looking really nice. But the one thing to remember is that as quick as this is, the more shatter points you create, obviously the more polygons you're creating, and it's going to have a hit on processor power. It's becoming much more processor intensive the more shards you have. So you could go nuts on shatter and have loads of layers with loads of shatter points, make an incredibly intricate shatter, and that would work, but it would begin to take longer to simulate. So the best strategy when doing destruction scenes is to get that real dynamic simulation realism in kind of the base shatter and make sure that it's all working properly with proper collisions like we have here with our xpBullet, but then add the very fine detail that you add to that simulation doesn't necessarily require such realism in its dynamics. Very tiny shards, you won't notice if perhaps they slightly intersect with each other or intersect with a bit of scene geometry. And for that reason, it's wise to use a mixture of different techniques to get all of that detail in there, but to keep your processor power down as much as possible, which makes your sim times as fast as possible. So now that we have this set up, let's look at different ways in which we can add further bits of detail to this shattering wall with the xParticles toolkit. So what we're going to do is we're going to create some dynamic debris here in a very kind of simulation efficient way. So to do that, let's just go to our xpShatter, and for now we'll just switch off our second Voronoi layer and we'll just have this very simple, very low shard count object. And there we go, and we've got it shattering away. Let's go to they're sliding quite a lot on the floor, aren't they? Let's go to our floor, to our collision tag. This is our xpBullet collider, and we'll put that bounce down and we'll put a bit of friction on there because we want these to roll really, not slide. Okay, that's looking good. And we can maybe go to our platonic. Let's go to the xp rigid body tag, go to dynamics, maybe add a little bit more linear velocity. We'll put that to 2500. That smashes through. Cool. Right, so let's add some particles. Now again, the way the technique that you decide to employ to add more detail depends on a few things. It depends on how close the camera is to the action, it depends on that camera angle, and it depends on the length of the shot. And all of those different variables dictate whether you can use some of the more quick to simulate tricks or not. So for example, let's just set up our scene with a camera here. So we're kind of looking at this how we may imagine our scene. So we'll put in a scene camera. Let's look through it, and we're going to position that camera. Let's go and give it a wide lens. So imagining the camera's fairly close to this pretty big wall. Let's give it a 20mm lens, and we can get right up close to it. And then we're going to get some nice effects as the debris comes shooting towards the camera. Okay, maybe move it across a bit. There we go, and let's just go to our shatter and let's activate that other layer and hit play, see how it looks. So got all these shards flying towards us, which looks pretty cool. That looks good. So let's add a couple more bits here. Let's go to the options and we'll enable depth of field, and then we'll go to our camera and we need to pick where we're going to focus. Let's have the wall as our focus object. So we'll take this pick here on the focus distance in the camera, click on the wall, and then we'll go to the physical tab of the camera and we need to adjust the aperture. So we'll put a really fast lens on. Let's put like a 1.0 aperture. And you'll see we're starting to get blur. We can go even lower than that. It's not the real world, is it? There we go. So now we're getting the foreground shards really blurry. And then bang, those pieces come towards us. And that looks really good. And we can even go even more on that effect, couldn't we? Make them really blurry. There we go. And they're blurring as they're coming towards the camera. All right. That looks cool. So let's add some more detail to this. Well, one thing we could do actually is that we could shatter the platonic as well as the wall. Depending on what the platonic was, what material we were simulating, it might smash itself as it hits the wall. So let's do that first. We'll go to generators. Let's add another shatter in. We'll put our platonic as a child of the shatter. We'll move the tag onto the shatter itself, not the platonic. And in the shatter, we're not going to need 40 shatter points. If we just come out this camera and have a look at the platonic, that's going to shatter into loads of pieces, which may be what you want, but we can get away with having fewer pieces, which will be quicker to simulate. All right, let's just go into that display tab, switch off those cut edges. All right, back into our camera, hit play. And now our platonic has shattered as it's hit the wall, and we're no longer getting one piece of platonic flying through. It's all just crumbling as if it were a rock shattering as it hits the wall. Okay. So let's add some more detail. Well, what we can do, we can really cheat this and get fast simulating debris. Is if we come out this camera, we can just find out at what point our platonic hits the wall. So it's at like frame 9 through to frame 14, say. So let's go to our emitters folder in the system. Let's create an emitter. And this emitter will go to the object tab, and we want to emit from the platonic, or from the shattered platonic. So let's go to object. Let's drag in the shatter. Let's put polygon area, and that'll do for now. So then let's go to the emission tab, and let's do shot. And we want the shot to start at frame, say, 12, maybe last for 4 frames. And we want to have, let's just try 100 particles for now, just so we get an idea of how this is working. All right, so let's hit play. And now we're getting these particles. So obviously that doesn't look right. They're just kind of floating all over the place, aren't they? And that's because the particles aren't dynamic, so there isn't any gravity affecting them in this instance. They're just floating away. So what we can do is a couple of things. We can make these particles bullet dynamic if we want. So let's try that first. We'll go to the emitter. Let's go to the tags, INSYDIUM tags, bullet tags, and we'll put an xpBullet rigid body directly onto an emitter. Now if we hit play, they're falling to the ground and they're moving about the place. So that's pretty cool. What else could we do? Well, we could actually use some motion inheritance. So our particles are going to follow the motion of the platonic and not just fall directly to the floor here. Before we do that, we just need to address one thing in the emitter. Let's go to our emitter object. We'll go to the object tab, and we are emitting from our shatter, which is effectively a number of shards. And so because of that, we need to just go down to the bottom here where it says object chain, and instead of the default use first object, we need to connect objects. And now when we do that, we're going to get a much more evenly distributed emission of particles. That's working correctly. So now what we want to do is inherit some of the motion that the platonic has. So to do that, let's go to our emission tab. Let's go to the motion inheritance tab. So normally would be on emission. We can go to motion inheritance. Let's activate it. Now this may be a little bit too strong. Let's have a look. We don't want the particles to be dragged along too much. Yeah, it's a bit quick. But you can see the effect. These are dynamic particles interacting with the floor and all of the shards, and they're being emitted from the platonic as it shatters. So this is giving us that debris, and we might get away with that. Let's just reduce some of that speed blend so they're not quite propelled forward as much. So then let's go back into our scene camera, and we'll see these shattered particles, and we can really see the effect working now. And you can see that having particles in this dynamic way has hardly slowed down this simulation whatsoever, but we've introduced loads more dynamic objects to our scene. So let's just go to our emitter. Let's go to the emission tab, here, and just increase them. Let's put, say, 700. And let's see what we get. So this is going to be a bit slower, obviously, because we've got 7 times the amount of dynamic objects, but we're getting pretty decent playback. And look at that debris detail that we are gaining from this. Now, one thing that we need to do when we make particles dynamic, we need to remember some of those friction and bounce settings. So in the tag itself, we have got bounce and friction. We don't really want much bounce. We can have a bit of scatter actually, and a lot of friction. We want these to slow down. Let's have a look. And there we go. That's looking good. Very nice. And we could also remember when you're using any bullet with any kind of particle-driven objects, like particles or generated objects or sprite objects, you need to remember that the emitter has its own friction and bounce settings too. So go to the emitter, extended data tab, physical data, and look, let's put that bounce down. Let's put the friction up so we get those to get their movement arrested a little bit. And let's have a look. Very nice. Loads of cool extra debris happening in our scene. And again, these are dynamic, so these are interacting with all of our scene geometry, but it's a very fast calculating interaction because they're particles, it's just spherical. So why have we done this? Well, now that we've got the particles in there, we can generate some what look like quite highly detailed shards, but we're just going to use the particle position and the particle dynamics, which means we're going to get really nice, fast simulation times. So what we're going to do is we're going to create some geometry shards, just a few, maybe 5 or 6, and then we're going to use those to create instances where our dynamic particles are. So let's switch off our platonic and our wall for now, because we don't need those. And let's just protect this camera position. Let's go to tags, rigging tags, protection. Now we can't move that camera and we'll come out of it. Right, so what we're going to do is we're going to create some shards, and we can just use bullet to do that. So let's go and get a platonic, lift it up, and that platonic, I'm going to put it, let's go to xparticles, generators, shatter, stick it in there. So now we have created a load of shards. Let's go to the shatter and we'll go tags, INSYDIUM tags, and let's put a bullet rigid body on there. And if we hit play, it's going to crumble to the floor. And now we've made a load of shards. Excellent. So then what we can do is if we go to our shatter and just hit C to make it editable. In fact, we can take that rigid body tag off before we do that. Just remove that. Make this editable by hitting C. And now we just have a null with all of our different shards. And this is what we can use to create our debris. So, I mean, I'm just going to get some random ones. Let's go shard 1. I'm holding shift 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And let's just pick 7. So now we've got 7 shards. Let's hit Control C. And in fact, we'll just drag those up out of that. We'll delete that null that has the rest of the shards we're not using. And now we have all of our shards. And there they are, looking pretty good. Excellent. And that's looking good. So let's just select all of those shards. And we'll go to coordinates. And let's just reset all of those positions so they're all just on top of each other. Excellent. So these are going to be our objects which we are going to be instancing. So we can just keep them up here for now. So now what we're going to do is this. Let's reactivate our shatter wall and our platonic. And hit play. And we have our particles. Let's go to our emitter and just let's emit fewer particles just for now, because this is going to be lumps of debris. So 700 is probably too much. Let's put it out to 400 and we're going to get faster viewport playback, and it's still going to look really detailed. There we go. So now what we're going to do is this. Let's get a, go to our generators menu in xparticles, and we're going to pick an XP generator. Here it is. And the XP generator, we're going to put all of our shards as children of the XP generator. I've got one that I missed. Let's drag that in as well. And then in our XP generator, it's going to say which emitter do you want to reference? What object do you want to make these shards from? So let's make it from our emitter. And let's have a look. So we can pick clone type instance. And we are using multiple child objects sequentially. So it's going through these one by one. We could just put randomly. Okay, hit play. And now you can see that we have got all of these tiny bits of debris. Let's just hit NA to get rid of those lines. And you can see that they're coloured blue because our particles were blue. It's inheriting the colour. But you can see, look, we've generated all of these tiny shards. And they are taking the same movement as our particles. But because it's the particles which are driving the dynamics, which is very fast dynamics, we're getting kind of the best of both worlds. We're getting the look of the generated shards, but we're getting the speed of the particles. Now this goes back to, whether you want to use this method, goes back to how accurate you need your sim. If you need every single shard to be perfectly interacting with itself and other scene geometry, because your camera is very close in, for example, then you may need to actually make the generator the dynamic object and have the bullet tag on the generator, not the emitter. The disadvantage of that is that it's having to generate lots more collision geometry, so it'll be more processor intensive. For us, we can get away with these just having the bullet collisions being worked out on a particle spherical basis. But that's looking cool. And these are going to interact properly with all of these bits of geometry, all of the bits of the floor, and it's going to look and fit in the scene really well. So now let's make some adjustments to these, because they're all, at the moment, all of these shards are getting their shape from their reference object, from our shard objects that were put in the generator, but they're getting their size from the particle radius. And that's, if we go to the generator, go to the scale, rotation and offset tab, you can see that we're scaling using particle radius. So let's go to our emitter, and let's give them kind of random sizes and some variation. So let's put them at, say, 5 centimeters with 4 centimeters of variation. And let's just have fewer so we can have a faster running sim. Let's hit play. So now we've got different size shards. And that's looking really nice. So what you can do, if you want to get more variation, you could have one emitter and one generator spitting out a number of larger shards with a bit of variation, and then another emitter and another generator spitting out much more tiny shards with a little bit of variation. And that's going to give you a much more realistic spread. But for us, this will do for now. That's fine. We're going to have this with a nice bit of variation. Let's go into our scene camera and we can hit play. And then we're getting those really nice interactive shards flying towards the camera, interacting with the bit of the scene. We've got good playback, bouncing on the floor. And that's looking pretty cool. So let's just, so we can view this, let's switch off this depth of field, because obviously depth of field gives that nice sense of depth and a dramatic look, but it also hides a lot of sins. So let's just switch it off so we can see exactly what this shard interaction is like in our scene. Because one of the negative aspects of using this system is that obviously the shards aren't using their own shapes as collision objects, they're spherical, and so sometimes you can see them kind of sliding and rolling a bit on the floor where they should be a little bit more jumpy and jerky. But actually in this instance, these are looking really good, and obviously they're so small in the scene that you wouldn't notice, and so the benefit that we're getting from those particles is fine. That's looking really good. All right, so let's just make this look a little bit more dramatic. We'll put our depth of field back on in a second, but let's just put a bit of very basic scene lighting here, and we'll do a really basic kind of daylight scene lighting, and this is kind of an old lighting setup that we used to do before we had a wonderfully fast realistic renderers like Cycles 4D. This is an old kind of viewport and standard renderer lighting trick, but we'll just do a kind of a daylight rig. So what we'll do is we'll bring in a Cinema 4D light. We will make this light, if we change the type from Omni to Infinite, I'm just going to lift this up slightly. So this is an infinite light, and you can see that it has this illumination indicator, which is saying the light is going in that direction. So if I hit the R key for rotate and point it down slightly, it's starting to light it. So this would be simulating a dusk or a dawn scene where there isn't much light. It's only just poking over the horizon. We can't really see the effects of it too much yet, though. Let's go to the light. Let's add a ray traced shadow. We're not seeing that shadow because we need to enable it in our options. So let's go to options, shadows, and now we're seeing this shadow. Let's rotate that around a bit, hit W for world, and there we go. So now we've got this kind of shadow effect. Excellent, and let's give that, we're doing daylight, so let's give that a bit of a orange hue because this is kind of dawn or dusk, as I say. Maybe not quite so orange, maybe a little bit later in the day. And then the other trick we can do is we can make that shadow slightly less dense so we can see the floor through it a little, and then we can get another light. Now this light is just going to simulate the kind of the ambient light you're getting from the dome, from the blue sky. So let's go into this light, and the way in which we'll simulate that is we'll set ambient illumination, which will make everything look really milky. And we'll make this blue to simulate the sky dome on a blue sunshiny day. And then look, we'll just reduce this intensity down. And what it does, it just gives that kind of milky blue glow that you get from on a bright sunny day. So then if we go back into our camera and we then switch on our depth of field, and now if we hit play, and now suddenly with the shadows we're getting a bit of lighting that makes this feel a bit more dramatic. Very nice. Now, we're not texturing this in this tutorial, but obviously we've got these bright blue shattered objects here, and that's because our generated objects are taken on the color of our debris emitter. So let's just change that. We'll go to the emitter, let's go to the display tab, and let's pick not single color, let's just do a gradient random. And the gradient random, let's just make a couple of adjustments to this default gradient. So we'll get rid of this knot and we'll get rid of this knot. We will distribute those two, and then let's make an adjustment to this blue, and we'll just take the saturation out of there and we'll give it a bit of gray, and then the white knot will give it a bit of grey as well. So now we're just getting a bit of a variation now of greys in our rubble. Let's hit play. That's looking a bit better, obviously, because we don't have bright blue rubble. But we're getting loads of detail in there. And again, it's simulating pretty cheaply because we're using this really nice method of using the particles to be the bullet dynamic object, not the objects themselves. All right, that's looking really cool. So just finally, the next element that we're going to add, because this is as part of the xParticles toolkit, we can use everything to try and make stuff look as dramatic as possible. So what we want to do now is take this and actually create some dust, and we're going to make volumetric dust, which will look really cool at render time when you're lighting it with the light shining through that dust. And we're going to do that by creating an xpShatter FX sim. So let's get this set up. What we'll do whilst we're making this sim is we will do a couple of things. For a start, we won't run all of the simulation just as we're setting things up because it's just more processor intensive and it's needless. So let's go to our, first of all, we'll go to our Shatter Platonic. And let's just go to the Object tab and we'll just disable that Voronoi layer, which means the Platonic isn't going to shatter into pieces when it moves. And we'll also go to the Shatter, the Wall Shatter, and we'll disable the more detailed shatter. So if we hit NB, now we've just got a simulation that can run very quickly because the Platonic isn't shattering more than once, nor is the wall. We've still got our debris, which will switch off whilst we're just setting up this sim. So before we switch that off, what we're going to do, let's just duplicate the emitter, which is for our debris. So let's say organize. We'll name this one Emitter Debris. And then let's duplicate it by holding Control or Command, dragging it down. And this second one, let's take off the bullet tag. And on this one, we'll rename it Emitter Dust. And then we'll switch off the emitter debris for now because we don't need it. Let's just have a look at what we've got. So there's our dust particles. Let's come out of that camera. So this is going to be, we're going to use these particles to drive some xpShatter smoke. And all we need them to do is be alive for a little amount of time and then maybe die off somewhere like that. So let's go to that emitter dust. We'll go to the emission and the lifespan. We'll set the lifespan. Well, look, they're emitting at frame 12 and we want them to finish at about frame 30, 31. So let's just give them a lifespan of, say, 15 frames with 10 variation. So kind of 5 either side of 15. So then they'll be born and then they'll disappear. Very cool. That's all we need. So then what we'll do with those particles is we need to give them some fuel, some information, so xpShatter can work on that fuel. So let's go to the emitter dust. We'll go to the extended data tab. We'll go to the physical data. And what we're going to do is give them, all we're going to give them actually is a smoke value of 1. Let's give them 1 smoke and that's it. Now we're going to go to our xParticles System Dynamics tab, and in the objects we're going to look for an xpShatter. There it is. And that brings in a domain here which we need to resize, and you can see this if I just select it and bring it up. There's our xpShatter domain. So we want this to be, well, it obviously needs to be wide enough to encapsulate our wall and scene, and then it needs to be deep enough to be able to come towards the camera, and obviously tall enough to take everything in. So something like that. There we go. We want it to go hit the floor. Okay, good. So what we can do here actually is ensure that if we hit F5 for the orthographic views, and then let's go to this right-hand view, let's maximize that. Let's make sure that the floor of our xpShatter kind of matches our floor of our scene. And then in the xpShatter, we can come down in the Solver tab. We can come down and we can close off the bottom floor, -Y. This means that if the dust drops down, it'll kind of bounce off the floor as it would in a proper scene. So let's hit F1. So that should be encapsulating that entire simulation area. Now we've scaled this up quite a lot, which is going to suggest that the default 4 centimeters voxel size is probably going to be too detailed for what we need. It's going to be quite heavy simulation, this. And we can visualize that. If we go to the display tab, go to the bounds, and we put back, this is representing the voxel grid in a 2D form, but this grid fills this entire volume. And if we dolly in, it's very dense. That is a lot of 3-dimensional information that's being saved every frame for that simulation. If we go back to the Solver tab with a voxel size of 4, and we don't need that, especially when we're setting it up. So let's put this up at, say, 16. And now we've got fewer voxels in this volume. So let's now get this simulation set up. So in our XP emitter dust, we've given it the smoke value, but we need to give it a tag so it can talk to the xpShatter object. So let's go to tags, INSYDIUM tags, and we want to give it a xpShatter source. And we don't actually need any heat or fuel, any of that. We could pass on some velocity. In fact, we could give it more velocity, which is going to encourage that smoke when it's created to kind of continue that path forward that it's getting from the particle. All right. And because our voxel size, we've made it pretty big, let's go to our emitter, to the emission tab, and let's increase the radius of these particles. Let's make it, say, 15. So now let's just play through a few frames. And you can see we're getting something solving here, but we're not seeing an awful lot. So what we need to do, we need to go to the xpShatter. Let's decrease that voxel size a little. We don't need to simulate fuel or heat, and we need to display what we have simulated. So let's go to the display tab, and let's pick, instead of fuel and smoke, let's just pick smoke. And there you can see, here is our smoke. Let's hit play. So those particles are creating that smoke. It's simulating its way through. Let's go to our scene camera. Hit play. That's looking okay. Now, because our platonic isn't shattering, we're just getting those particles from this one position, which is why we're getting just kind of like one lump of smoke here. But when we now go back and activate our shatter platonic, reactivate that Voronoi layer so the platonic actually shatters into pieces, we'll get much more of a spread. So we're getting this spreading out of smoke from those platonic pieces. I think let's give it less velocity. It's really kind of shooting forward too much, that smoke. So let's go back to our emitter dust xpShatter tag. Let's reduce that velocity down to just to say 100%. There we go. Very nice. And let's go to our xpShatter settings, and we'll go to the simulation tab, and let's have a look at the settings that we have. Now, what we can do is we can give this smoke less buoyancy, so it's going to sink down a little quicker. Let's go to our display settings, and we are in slices, 32 slices with a resolution of 64. Let's just increase that to 64 slices to thicken it up a bit, and increase our resolution up to, say, 90. And obviously we don't want the smoke to be black, so we'll take these smoke colors. Let's just give that a little bit of value to make it more gray, and let's just bring that down, which gives us more of a white. So we're adjusting the smoke color gradient here, and that's looking much more like dust. Very cool. All right, so let's do a couple more things here. Let's take, let's say we want this maybe to drop down a little bit more heavily. So we can go to our xpShatter, to our simulation, and let's reduce our smoke buoyancy even more. And then we can also dissipate that smoke so it kind of disappears in the air. At the moment, there's no dissipation whatsoever. So let's put this on, say, 0.6 dissipation. Very nice. Now let's go to our shatter object, which is our wall. And let's reactivate our other Voronoi layer, which is going to give us the detail. Play it through. Now, obviously, it's going to take longer because it's generating an awful lot more geometry now. But now we're getting this really nice look with our smoke and dust layer. It's perhaps dissipating a little bit too quickly now, that isn't it? So let's go back to our xpShatter. Let's reduce that dissipation. And we can maybe try and pump a little bit more smoke into this. So let's go to our emitter dust, to the extended data tab. We can add, say, 10 smoke. Very cool. And finally, let's select our emitter debris, which is going to create our debris particles. Go back. Now we're generating an awful lot of dynamic objects now, and none of this is cached, so this is all playing in real time in the viewport. So we're going to get a slowed down viewport performance, but we're looking pretty good. If you imagine the amount of geometry that's being generated and the amount of calculations that are being made per frame, this is now looking really detailed and very good. All right. And we could possibly, just before we do a render of this, we'll do a hardware render, we could take our XpShatter and let's go to the solver. Let's just reduce that voxel size down somewhat so we get some more detail in that smoke. And before, let's just do a quick test of that to see how it looks. We'll deactivate that debris emitter again, just so we're not processing too much information. So here we go. Yeah, so we've got a much more higher resolution dust coming out there, which is looking really nice. Very cool indeed. All right, so that's looking very cool. Let's do a viewport render now so we can view this in kind of real time and get a really good idea of how this is looking. So to do that, let's do a couple of things first. Let's reactivate our emitter debris. Let's go to our xpShatter object. We'll go to the display tab and let's just get rid of all of this viewport stuff. So we'll go to the grid options and put that to none. We'll select the show adaptive bounds and switch that off. That's looking pretty good. Right, so then let's go to our render, to our edit render settings. We'll change this to viewport renderer. We'll switch off save. We'll just do it to the picture viewer. We'll do 720p, which is fine. We'll do the first 200 frames. And then let's go to our viewport renderer settings and we will copy effects from viewport. Let's just make sure we've got depth of field selected. We've got shadow selected. Let's go to the shadows and just make sure that they're going to be high res enough. So we'll just increase that shadow map size and let's add some super sampling 2x2. We'll go to the filter and let's just make sure we've got everything we need there. Let's just turn off these axes. We don't need that. And that'll probably do us for now. Okay, good. So we'll just get rid of those. And we will go to render to picture viewer. Yes, continue without saving. So this is going to chug through. It's going to take slightly longer than it would normally because we've increased those shadow maps and we've also done some super sampling, but it's still going to be fairly quick. So we'll pause this here now. When it's finished, I will come back to you, tell you how long it took, and we'll have a play through this viewport preview sim. So we've stopped that sim at 106 frames because with the majority of the simulation had finished there, all of the processor intensive stuff had already simulated with that dust dissipating. And that was pretty quick, 1 minute and 32 seconds for 160 frames. So let's just bring this back to the beginning, we'll just make it full screen and we'll play through. And you can see that we're getting this really nice destruction scene. And these big, large shards. We've got our platonic, which is splitting up as well. We've got all of that debris flying about the place. And then we've got our dust particles, which are emitting this dust explosion. And all very quick to set up, all pretty self-explanatory. This remains a procedural rig, so adjustments are really easy to make. And this is looking like a really nice result at this preview resolution.